When 17-year-old Maya Rodriguez watched the bullies tear her precious family photograph into pieces right in front of her face, laughing as the fragments scattered across the cafeteria floor like confetti, they had no idea they had just crossed a line that would change everything. What appeared to be another helpless victim cowering before their cruelty was actually a girl who had spent the last 6 years transforming herself into a weapon of precision and power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same hands that trembled as she tried to gather the torn pieces of her most treasured possession were the same hands that had earned a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and dominated regional MMA competitions across 3 counties. But Maya's secret was about to become their nightmare, and the quiet girl they thought they could break was about to show them exactly what happens when you push the wrong person too far. Maya Rodriguez had always been the kind of person who preferred shadows to spotlights, silence to noise, and solitude to the complicated social dynamics that seemed to consume her classmates at Lincoln High School. At 17, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that others often mistook for shyness or weakness, her dark eyes observing the world with an intensity that few people ever noticed. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with shoulder-length brown hair that she usually kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, Maya dressed in oversized hoodies and worn jeans that deliberately obscured the lean, muscled frame underneath. Her backpack was always heavy with textbooks and notebooks filled with meticulous notes, evidence of a student who took her education seriously despite the chaos that often surrounded her. The photograph that would ultimately change everything was tucked safely in the front pocket of that same backpack, protected by a small plastic sleeve that Maya checked obsessively throughout each day. The image captured a moment of pure happiness from 3 years earlier, showing Maya sandwiched between her parents and younger brother Danny at the state fair, all 4 faces glowing with genuine joy and love. It was taken just 2 months before her father Miguel was deployed overseas with the National Guard and 6 weeks before the roadside bomb that would bring him home in a flag-draped coffin. The photograph represented the last moment when Maya's family had been complete and carefree, making it more precious to her than any material possession she could imagine. Her mother Elena worked double shifts at the local hospital as a nursing assistant, trying to keep their small family afloat on a single income while managing her own grief. Danny, now 14 and struggling with anger issues stemming from their father's death, had started hanging out with a rough crowd that worried Maya constantly. The family's modest apartment in the working-class neighborhood of Riverside felt empty and quiet most of the time, filled with memories of a man whose absence seemed to grow larger rather than smaller as time passed. Maya had become the unofficial head of household by necessity, helping Danny with homework, preparing meals when their mother worked late, and maintaining the careful financial balance that kept them from falling behind on rent and utilities. What her family didn't know, what none of her classmates suspected, and what Maya guarded as carefully as she protected that photograph, was that she had been training in mixed martial arts for the past 6 years. It had started innocently enough when she was 11 years old, and her father had enrolled her in a local Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, hoping to give his daughter confidence and self-defense skills. Miguel Rodriguez had served 2 previous deployments and understood the value of being able to protect yourself in dangerous situations. He had researched the instructor carefully, selecting Professor Carlos Mendoza's academy because of its reputation for discipline, respect, and technical excellence rather than flashy showmanship. Professor Mendoza ran his academy with the precision of a military operation and the warmth of a family gathering. The small building tucked between an auto repair shop and a laundromat didn't look impressive from the outside, but inside it housed one of the most respected martial arts programs in the region. The walls were covered with photos of students who had gone on to compete at national levels, inspirational quotes about perseverance and humility, and tournament trophies that spoke to the quality of instruction provided. Maya had fallen in love with the sport immediately, drawn to the chess-like strategy of ground fighting, and the way it rewarded technique and intelligence over size and aggression. During those early years when her father was still alive, Miguel would attend every one of Maya's classes, watching from the sidelines with pride as his daughter learned to navigate the complex world of submissions, escapes, and positional dominance. He understood better than most that martial arts wasn't about violence or aggression, but about discipline, problem-solving, and the confidence that came from knowing you could handle yourself in difficult situations. After each class, father and daughter would drive home together, discussing techniques and strategies while sharing a bag of tacos from their favorite food truck. Those car rides represented some of Maya's happiest memories, moments when she felt completely connected to her father and excited about the skills she was developing. When Miguel was killed overseas, Maya's world collapsed in ways that no 11-year-old should ever have to experience. The funeral was a blur of uniforms, flags, and well-meaning relatives who didn't know what to say to a grieving child. Elena had considered canceling Maya's martial arts classes, partly due to financial concerns and partly because everything that reminded them of Miguel felt too painful to continue. But Professor Mendoza had approached the family after the funeral and offered to continue Maya's training at no cost, understanding that the discipline and structure of martial arts might be exactly what she needed to process her grief in a healthy way. The decision to continue training proved to be one of the most important choices Maya ever made. The academy became her sanctuary, a place where she could channel her anger and sadness into something productive and powerful. Professor Mendoza recognized that Maya was dealing with trauma and adjusted his teaching approach accordingly, emphasizing the meditative aspects of martial arts and the importance of emotional control alongside physical technique. He paired her with older, more experienced students who served as mentors and surrogate big sisters, creating a support network that helped Maya navigate the difficult process of growing up without her father. Over the following 6 years, Maya threw herself into training with an intensity that impressed even her experienced instructor. She attended classes 5 days a week, studied technique videos online, and practiced movement drills in her bedroom when the academy was closed. Her natural athleticism combined with an analytical mind made her a formidable student, but it was her emotional investment in the sport that truly set her apart. Every technique she mastered felt like a way of honoring her father's memory while building strength for the challenges she knew lay ahead. The progression through belt ranks came steadily but never easily. Maya earned each promotion through countless hours of drilling, sparring sessions that left her exhausted and occasionally bruised, and tournaments where she tested her skills against competitors from other schools. Professor Mendoza maintained high standards for all his students, but he was particularly demanding of Maya because he recognized her exceptional potential. She earned her blue belt at 13, her purple belt at 15, and was already working toward her brown belt despite being younger than most students at her level. What made Maya truly dangerous wasn't just her technical skill, though her ground game was consistently rated among the best in her age division at regional competitions. It was her ability to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically even when adrenaline was flooding her system, and to adapt her approach based on her opponent's weaknesses. She had developed a reputation in tournament circles as someone who never lost her composure, never fought angry, and never underestimated her opponents regardless of their size or apparent skill level. Coaches from other academies often pointed to Maya as an example of what proper martial arts training could produce, a young woman who embodied the mental and physical aspects of the discipline in equal measure. The contrast between Maya's public persona at school and her identity at the academy was striking and entirely intentional. At Lincoln High School, she was nearly invisible, the quiet girl who sat in the back of classrooms, ate lunch alone while reading, and avoided any situation that might draw attention to herself. She had learned early that being noticed at school rarely led to positive outcomes for someone from her background, and she had developed a carefully cultivated appearance of vulnerability that kept her off the radar of both predators and authority figures who might ask uncomfortable questions about her home life. But 3 days a week at Mendoza's academy, Maya transformed into someone completely different. She moved with fluid confidence, spoke with authority about complex techniques, and commanded respect from training partners who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. The shy teenager who mumbled answers in English class became a fierce competitor who could discuss strategy with the sophistication of a seasoned fighter. Her training partners knew her as someone who could submit opponents twice her size and never lost her temper even during the most intense sparring sessions. The secrecy surrounding her martial arts training wasn't entirely about maintaining a low profile at school. Maya understood that her fighting skills could become a liability if the wrong people discovered them. She had seen how other students with reputations for toughness became targets for challenges and confrontations, forced into situations where they had to either fight or lose face. More importantly, she worried about how her mother might react if she fully understood the level of contact involved in MMA training. Elena had enough stress managing work and family responsibilities without worrying about her daughter getting injured in what she might perceive as needlessly dangerous activities. Maya's academic performance reflected the same discipline and focus that characterized her martial arts training. She maintained a solid B+ average despite working part-time at a local grocery store to help with family expenses and spending significant time training.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Her teachers generally regarded her as a reliable, hard-working student who rarely caused problems and consistently turned in assignments on time. She wasn't the most vocal participant in class discussions, but her written work demonstrated critical thinking skills and attention to detail that impressed her instructors. Her guidance counselor had mentioned college possibilities several times, though Maya worried privately about the financial realities of higher education given her family's circumstances. The social dynamics at Lincoln High School were typical of most large public schools, with clearly defined hierarchies based on wealth, athletic achievement, social media popularity, and family connections. Maya existed almost entirely outside these systems, partly by choice and partly due to circumstances beyond her control. She wasn't wealthy enough to run with the popular crowds, wasn't interested in the drama that seemed to consume many of her female classmates, and had learned that friendships required time and emotional energy that she couldn't always spare given her responsibilities at home. This isolation had served as protection for most of her high school career, allowing her to focus on academics and training without the complications that social entanglements often brought. She had friendly relationships with a few classmates, particularly other students who seemed to exist on the margins of the school's social ecosystem, but nothing deep enough to be called close friendships. Maya told herself that this was temporary, that college would offer opportunities for connections with people who shared her values and interests. For now, keeping her head down and avoiding attention seemed like the safest strategy. The bullying that would ultimately force Maya to reveal her hidden skills didn't begin with her as the primary target. Lincoln High School had its share of students who used cruelty and intimidation to establish their place in the social hierarchy, and Maya had witnessed numerous incidents where vulnerable classmates were targeted for harassment. She had always felt guilty about her inability to intervene, but she understood that drawing attention to herself could make her family's situation even more difficult. The unwritten rule of survival at schools like Lincoln was simple: don't get involved in other people's problems unless you're prepared to make those problems your own. The group that would eventually focus their attention on Maya was led by Jessica Manning, a 17-year-old whose combination of wealth, social connections, and calculated meanness had made her one of the most feared students at Lincoln High School. Jessica's father owned several successful car dealerships throughout the region, and her mother served on the school board, giving the family significant influence over school policies and disciplinary decisions. Jessica herself was attractive in the conventional sense, tall and blonde with an expensive wardrobe that made subtle statements about her family's financial status. But her true power came from her ability to identify and exploit other people's vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Jessica's inner circle consisted of 3 other girls who had aligned themselves with her for protection and social advantage. Amber Chen was the strategist of the group, academically gifted but morally flexible, who used her intelligence to plan psychological campaigns against their targets. Brittany Walsh served as the group's social media specialist, skilled at spreading rumors and manipulating online narratives to maximum effect. Kayla Foster was the enforcer, physically imposing and willing to engage in direct confrontation when subtler methods proved insufficient. Together, they had perfected a system of harassment that was sophisticated enough to avoid serious consequences, while being devastating enough to drive their victims away from school entirely. Their methods were varied and adaptive, changing based on the specific vulnerabilities of each target. They might start with social media attacks designed to isolate their victim from potential supporters, or spread rumors that damaged reputations and relationships. They were skilled at manipulating adults, presenting themselves as innocent victims when confronted about their behavior while painting their targets as troublemakers or attention seekers. Their campaigns often included property destruction, academic sabotage, and psychological intimidation that stopped just short of criminal behavior. Maya first appeared on their radar during her junior year, though initially she wasn't considered a primary target. Jessica's group typically focused on students who had something they wanted to take away, whether it was social status, romantic relationships, academic achievements, or simply attention that they felt belonged to them. Maya's carefully maintained invisibility should have protected her, but several factors combined to make her an attractive target for their particular brand of cruelty. The first factor was academic. Maya's consistent performance in advanced placement classes put her in direct competition with Amber Chen for class ranking and scholarship opportunities. Amber had noticed that Maya's test scores and assignment grades often exceeded her own, despite Maya's obvious lack of expensive tutoring and test preparation resources. This academic threat was compounded by several teachers who had begun using Maya's work as an example of what could be achieved through effort and dedication rather than privilege and parental pressure. For Amber, whose identity was built around being the smartest student in any room, Maya's quiet excellence represented a direct challenge to her status. The second factor was economic. Maya's work uniform from the grocery store, her practical clothing choices, and her reluctance to participate in expensive school activities marked her clearly as someone from a different socioeconomic background than Jessica's typical social circle. This difference made her an appealing target for a group that viewed economic status as a reflection of personal worth and social hierarchy. They interpreted Maya's humble background as evidence that she didn't belong at Lincoln High School and needed to be reminded of her place in the social order. The third and most significant factor was Maya's relationship with David Kim, a senior who had recently broken up with Jessica after a turbulent 6-month relationship. David was student body president, captain of the debate team, and bound for an Ivy League university on a full academic scholarship. His decision to end things with Jessica had been motivated partly by her treatment of other students, and partly by his growing interest in someone who seemed to represent everything that Jessica was not. Maya and David had been assigned as lab partners in AP chemistry, and their academic collaboration had gradually evolved into something deeper. David was drawn to Maya's intelligence, work ethic, and genuine kindness in ways that surprised him. Unlike Jessica, who demanded constant attention and validation, Maya was content to focus on their shared projects and conversations about their academic interests and future goals. She listened when he talked about the pressure he felt to maintain his perfect image, and she shared enough about her own challenges to help him understand that success meant different things to different people. Their relationship was still new and tentative, more friendship than romance, but it represented the first meaningful connection Maya had allowed herself to develop with a classmate. For Jessica, David's interest in Maya represented the ultimate betrayal and humiliation. She had assumed that their breakup was temporary, that David would eventually realize his mistake and return to her with appropriate apologies and gestures. The idea that he might prefer someone like Maya, someone without social status or material advantages, challenged everything Jessica believed about her own worth and desirability. It also represented a public rejection that threatened her carefully constructed image as someone who always won and never faced genuine consequences for her actions. The campaign against Maya began subtly, following Jessica's established pattern of gradually escalating harassment designed to test their target's responses and identify the most effective pressure points. It started with small acts of sabotage. Maya's locker combination was somehow discovered and changed, causing her to be late for classes while maintenance resolved the issue. Her carefully organized binders were knocked from her hands in hallways, scattering papers that she had to hurriedly collect, while other students stepped over and around her. Anonymous notes appeared in her backpack, questioning her worthiness to attend Lincoln High School, and suggesting that she might be happier at a school more suited to her background. Maya recognized the harassment for what it was, but initially chose to handle it the same way she had dealt with previous challenges, through documentation, patience, and strategic avoidance. She began varying her routes between classes, securing her belongings more carefully, and keeping detailed records of each incident including dates, times, and witnesses. Her martial arts training had taught her that the best fights were the ones you never had to have, and she hoped that by refusing to provide the reaction her harassers sought, they would eventually move on to easier targets. The harassment escalated when Maya's non-response failed to provide Jessica's group with the satisfaction they were seeking. Brittany Walsh created fake social media accounts to spread rumors about Maya's family situation, including cruel speculation about her father's death and her mother's work schedule. Amber Chen began undermining Maya's academic work, volunteering for group projects specifically to sabotage Maya's contributions and damage her grades. Kayla Foster started showing up at the grocery store where Maya worked, making loud comments about the poor quality of service and generally creating situations that could get Maya in trouble with her manager. Each incident was carefully designed to be difficult to prove or report. The fake social media accounts used generic names and profile pictures that could belong to anyone. The academic sabotage was presented as legitimate criticism or differences of opinion about project direction. Kayla's behavior at the grocery store was just rude enough to be disruptive but never quite crossed the line into obvious harassment. Jessica's group had perfected the art of plausible deniability, always maintaining alternative explanations for their actions that made it difficult for authority figures to take decisive action. Maya's attempts to address the harassment through official channels proved frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful. The school's anti-bullying policies sounded comprehensive on paper, but in practice they required clear evidence of specific incidents that met narrowly defined criteria. Maya's documentation was thorough, but most of the harassment she was experiencing fell into gray areas that administrators were reluctant to address decisively. When she finally requested a meeting with the assistant principal, she was told that personality conflicts between students were normal parts of the high school experience and that she should focus on her academic work rather than social drama. The response from school administration was particularly disappointing because Maya had hoped that her academic record and reputation as a responsible student would carry some weight in how her concerns were addressed. Instead, she found herself being counseled about the importance of resilience and adapting to challenging social situations. The message was clear. She was expected to handle the harassment on her own without creating additional problems for busy administrators who had more pressing concerns to address. Maya's mother, Elena, noticed that something was wrong, observing changes in her daughter's mood and behavior that concerned her. Maya had always been serious and focused, but she was becoming withdrawn in ways that seemed unhealthy. She was sleeping poorly, eating less, and showing signs of stress that reminded Elena uncomfortably of her own struggles after Miguel's death. When Elena tried to initiate conversations about what was happening at school, Maya deflected with reassurances that everything was fine and changes of subject that made it clear she didn't want to discuss the situation. The reluctance to confide in her mother stemmed partly from Maya's desire to protect Elena from additional worry, and partly from her understanding that her mother had limited ability to address problems at school. Elena worked long hours at the hospital and was already managing significant stress related to finances and Danny's behavioral issues. Maya didn't want to add school drama to her mother's list of concerns, especially when she wasn't sure what Elena could do to help, even if she did know what was happening. Maya's training at Professor Mendoza's academy provided some relief from the stress she was experiencing at school, but it also created internal conflict about how to handle her situation. Her martial arts education had emphasized self-defense and protection of others, but it had also taught her about the importance of de-escalation and avoiding unnecessary confrontations. She found herself in the uncomfortable position of possessing skills that could quickly end her harassment problems, while being morally and practically prohibited from using them. Professor Mendoza had noticed changes in Maya's training intensity and focus, recognizing signs that one of his students was dealing with significant stress outside the academy. During their conversations after class, he had encouraged Maya to talk about what was bothering her, offering the perspective of someone who had seen many young people work through difficult situations. Maya had shared some general information about social problems at school, but she had been careful not to provide details that might prompt Professor Mendoza to suggest direct action. The conversations with her instructor had reinforced Maya's understanding that her martial arts skills were meant for genuine self-defense situations, not for solving social conflicts or establishing dominance over people who were bothering her. Professor Mendoza had been clear throughout her training that the goal was to develop the confidence and ability to protect herself and others when no other options existed, not to use fighting as a first resort when dealing with difficult people. This philosophy had become deeply ingrained in Maya's thinking, making her reluctant to consider physical responses to problems that might be solved through other means. As winter progressed into spring, the harassment campaign against Maya intensified in both frequency and creativity. Jessica's group had apparently decided that their target was more resilient than expected and required additional pressure to achieve the desired result. They began involving other students in their efforts, spreading rumors and creating social pressure that made it difficult for anyone to associate with Maya without risking becoming targets themselves. The few casual friendships Maya had developed were strained as classmates began avoiding her to protect themselves from guilt by association. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the harassment for Maya to endure. She had always been somewhat solitary by choice, But being actively excluded felt completely different from choosing solitude. She found herself eating lunch in empty classrooms or the library, walking to classes alone while surrounded by groups of chattering classmates, and spending increasing amounts of time at work or training simply to avoid being at school when it wasn't necessary. The social ecosystem that she had navigated successfully for 3 years had become hostile in ways that made her question everything about her approach to high school survival. David Kim's growing friendship with Maya had become another source of stress rather than support. While she valued their connection and appreciated having someone to talk with about academic interests, she was increasingly aware that their relationship was putting him at risk of becoming a target himself. Jessica's group had begun making pointed comments about his choice of companions and spreading rumors about Maya's motivations for associating with him. Maya found herself pulling back from their friendship to protect David from harassment, a decision that left her feeling even more isolated and sad. The pressure was beginning to affect Maya's academic performance for the first time in her high school career. She found it difficult to concentrate during classes when she was constantly watching for the next incident or trying to anticipate what form the harassment might take. Her grades remained solid, but the effort required to maintain her standards was becoming exhausting. She was spending more time on assignments that used to come easily, and she was making careless mistakes that reflected her divided attention and increased stress levels. Maya's work performance at the grocery store also began to suffer as the harassment followed her to her place of employment. Kayla Foster's regular appearances had created a hostile work environment that was affecting Maya's interactions with customers and coworkers. Her manager had noticed the change and had spoken to her about the importance of maintaining professional demeanor regardless of personal problems. The job was crucial to her family's financial stability, and Maya lived in constant fear that the harassment campaign might cost her the income they desperately needed. The martial arts academy remained Maya's primary source of stability and confidence, but even there she was beginning to feel the effects of prolonged stress. Her training partners noticed that she was more intense during sparring sessions, using the physical exertion as an outlet for emotions she couldn't express elsewhere. Professor Mendoza observed that Maya was training harder than necessary and encouraged her to find balance between using martial arts as stress relief and maintaining the emotional control that was central to proper technique. The irony wasn't lost on Maya that she was learning to fight better than ever just as she was being forced to avoid fighting at all costs. The harassment reached a new level of creativity and cruelty as Jessica's group began targeting Maya's most vulnerable emotional areas. They had somehow discovered information about her father's military service and death, possibly through social media research or connections with other military families in the community. This information became the foundation for attacks that were designed to be maximally hurtful, while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intentions. Anonymous messages began appearing that questioned Miguel Rodriguez's heroism and suggested that his death had been the result of cowardice or incompetence, rather than enemy action. The messages were crafted to sound like they came from other military families who resented the attention given to fallen soldiers, making them particularly painful for Maya to receive and difficult to trace back to their actual sources. The attacks on her father's memory struck at the core of Maya's identity and values in ways that previous harassment had not, crossing lines that transformed annoying social conflict into something much more serious and personal. Maya's emotional control, strengthened through years of martial arts training and personal hardship, was being tested to its limits. She found herself struggling with anger and violent fantasies in ways that frightened her and conflicted with everything she had been taught about proper mental discipline. The urge to use her fighting skills to solve her problems was becoming stronger as the harassment became more personal and targeted. She began to understand how people could be pushed past their breaking points and make decisions that destroyed their own futures along with their tormentors. The photograph that would ultimately trigger Maya's explosive response to months of calculated harassment was the last remaining connection to a time when her family had been whole and happy. She carried it everywhere as a reminder of what she was working toward and what she had lost. Drawing strength from the memory of her father's love and pride, the image had sustained her through difficult moments throughout high school, serving as motivation when academic challenges seemed overwhelming and comfort when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. Jessica Manning's decision to target the photograph represented either brilliant psychological strategy or incredibly poor judgment about the consequences of crossing certain lines. She had observed Maya's protective behavior toward her backpack and had correctly identified that it contained something of significant emotional value. What she couldn't have known was that destroying that particular item would transform a quiet, controlled young woman into someone willing to abandon years of careful self-discipline in favor of direct action. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything for everyone involved. Maya Rodriguez had reached the limits of her patience and endurance. Jessica Manning and her group had perfected a campaign of harassment that they believed would finally break their target. The carefully maintained balance between Maya's public vulnerability and private strength was about to collapse in spectacular fashion. And the family photograph that represented everything Maya held dear was about to become the catalyst for revelations that would shock everyone who thought they knew the quiet girl who just wanted to survive high school without causing trouble. The transformation that was coming would prove that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear the most harmless. Maya's hidden skills, developed through years of disciplined training and emotional growth, were about to be unleashed in defense of something that could not be replaced or repaired. The bullies, who thought they had found another easy victim, were about to discover that they had chosen the wrong target at the wrong time, and their carefully constructed campaign of psychological warfare was about to backfire in ways they could never have anticipated. The spring semester brought an escalation in Jessica Manning's campaign that caught even Maya off guard with its sophisticated cruelty. What had begun as typical high school bullying evolved into something resembling psychological warfare, with each attack carefully designed to exploit Maya's vulnerabilities while maintaining enough plausible deniability to avoid serious consequences. Jessica had apparently studied Maya's routines, relationships, and emotional triggers with the methodical approach of a military strategist planning a siege. The first major escalation came during Maya's AP chemistry class, where her partnership with David Kim had become one of the few bright spots in her increasingly difficult school experience. Maya arrived to find her lab notebook missing from her assigned station, containing weeks of careful observations and calculations that represented hours of meticulous work. When she approached the teacher, Mrs. Patterson, about the missing notebook, she was told that proper organization and security of materials was part of student responsibility, and that she would need to recreate her work before the next major assessment. Maya knew immediately that the disappearance wasn't accidental, but proving deliberate theft would require evidence she didn't possess. She spent the lunch period searching through trash cans and empty classrooms, hoping to recover the notebook, or at least find evidence of who had taken it. The futile search left her feeling helpless and angry, emotions that she struggled to control as she sat through afternoon classes, trying to focus on lessons while internally seething about the injustice of the situation. David noticed Maya's distress and offered to share his own notes, but Maya declined out of concern that accepting help might make him a more direct target for harassment. She had already observed how Jessica's group monitored their interactions, looking for opportunities to create problems for both of them. The decision to handle the situation alone meant additional hours of work recreating lost research, time that Maya could barely spare given her job responsibilities and family obligations. The pattern established with the missing lab notebook repeated itself across multiple areas of Maya's academic life. Her locker combination was changed repeatedly, requiring frequent trips to the main office that made her late for classes and created a record of tardiness that could affect her academic standing. Her carefully organized study materials were repeatedly disturbed, with highlighters disappearing, notes being shuffled out of order, and textbooks being moved to locations where she couldn't find them until after missing assignment deadlines. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed as normal high school chaos or personal carelessness, but the cumulative effect was devastating to Maya's academic routine and emotional stability. She began carrying all essential materials with her constantly, resulting in a backpack so heavy that it caused physical discomfort and drew comments from other students about her paranoid behavior. The extra weight and bulk made navigating crowded hallways more difficult and contributed to the image of someone who was struggling to manage basic organizational skills. Amber Chen's involvement in the harassment campaign proved particularly effective because of her academic credibility and understanding of how to undermine Maya's scholastic achievements. During group projects, Amber would volunteer to work with Maya specifically to sabotage her contributions, while maintaining the appearance of being a helpful collaborator. She would suggest research directions that led nowhere, provide incorrect information that Maya would waste time pursuing, and then present alternative solutions that made Maya's work appear inadequate or irrelevant. The academic sabotage was especially painful for Maya because education represented her primary path toward a better future for herself and her family. Every assignment that was compromised, every project that was undermined, and every grade that suffered represented a potential setback to her college prospects and scholarship opportunities. Maya understood that her family's financial situation made academic achievement essential rather than optional, adding pressure that her harassers couldn't fully comprehend but were successfully exploiting. Brittany Walsh's social media expertise created a different type of problem for Maya, one that extended beyond school hours and invaded what should have been safe spaces. Fake accounts began following Maya's limited social media presence, analyzing her posts for personal information that could be used against her. Photos of her family, her work uniform, and her modest living situation were screenshot and shared in group chats that she wasn't part of, but that other students occasionally mentioned in ways that made it clear her private life had become public entertainment. The online harassment was particularly insidious because it was largely invisible to adults, while being completely obvious to Maya's peer group. Memes featuring her work uniform appeared and disappeared quickly enough to avoid detection by school authorities, but lasted long enough for classmates to see and share them. Comments about her family's financial situation were embedded in seemingly innocent posts about school events or academic achievements, creating a constant stream of subtle humiliation that followed her everywhere. Maya discovered the extent of the online campaign when a classmate she barely knew approached her after English class to express sympathy about the things being said about her online. The conversation was awkward and painful, making it clear that Maya's personal business had become common knowledge among students who had no connection to her life. The realization that strangers were discussing her family's circumstances and forming opinions about her worthiness to attend Lincoln High School based on incomplete and often inaccurate information was almost as difficult to handle as the harassment itself. Kayla Foster's role as the physical intimidator of Jessica's group became more prominent as other methods failed to produce the desired results. Her appearances at Maya's workplace became more frequent and disruptive, often involving complaints about service quality that required manager intervention and created uncomfortable situations for Maya with her coworkers. Kayla would arrive during busy periods when Maya couldn't avoid serving her, then find reasons to demand refunds, speak to supervisors, or generally create scenes that made Maya appear incompetent or difficult to work with. The workplace harassment was particularly stressful because Maya's job was essential to her family's financial stability and her own college savings. She lived in constant fear that the ongoing problems would result in termination or reduction of hours, either of which would create serious hardships at home. Her manager had begun asking questions about why Maya seemed to have so many problems with particular customers, and Maya struggled to explain the situation without sounding paranoid or difficult. Maya's attempts to address the workplace harassment through official channels proved as frustrating as her efforts at school. The grocery store's human resources department was more concerned about potential lawsuits from customers than protecting employees from harassment, and Maya was counseled about maintaining professional demeanor regardless of personal feelings about individual customers. The message was clear. As long as customers weren't explicitly threatening violence, employees were expected to handle difficult situations without complaining or requesting assistance. The psychological toll of managing harassment across multiple environments began to affect Maya's performance in all areas of her life. She was sleeping poorly, often lying awake planning responses to potential problems or replaying incidents from the day. Her appetite decreased as stress affected her digestion and eating schedule, leading to weight loss that she couldn't afford given her athletic training requirements. Her concentration suffered as she found herself constantly scanning for threats rather than focusing on immediate tasks. Maya's mother, Elena, noticed the changes in her daughter's behavior and appearance with growing concern. Maya had always been serious and focused, but she was becoming withdrawn and anxious in ways that seemed unhealthy and familiar. Elena recognized some of the signs from her own experience with depression following Miguel's death, and she worried that Maya was developing similar mental health issues without having adequate support or resources to address them effectively. The conversations between mother and daughter about Maya's obvious distress became increasingly frequent and frustrating for both parties. Elena knew something was seriously wrong, but felt helpless to address problems she couldn't identify or understand. Maya wanted to protect her mother from additional worry, while also craving support and guidance that she couldn't request without revealing the full extent of her situation. The resulting conversations were filled with half-truths and deflections that satisfied neither person while increasing tension in their relationship. Maya's training at Professor Mendoza's academy became both refuge and source of internal conflict as the harassment campaign intensified. The physical exertion and mental focus required for martial arts training provided temporary relief from the constant stress of school and work. But Maya found herself struggling with violent fantasies and aggressive impulses that contradicted everything she had been taught about proper martial arts mindset and emotional control. During sparring sessions, Maya caught herself imagining her training partners as her tormentors, using more force than necessary and taking satisfaction in successful techniques that caused discomfort or submission. Professor Mendoza noticed the change in her approach and spoke with her privately about the importance of maintaining emotional equilibrium and using training as a way to build character rather than express anger. The conversations were helpful, but also reminded Maya of how far her mental state had deteriorated under pressure. The martial arts philosophy that had sustained Maya through previous challenges was being tested by circumstances that seemed to have no honorable resolution. She had been taught that fighting should be a last resort, used only when no other options existed for protecting herself or others. But her current situation involved psychological rather than physical threats that martial arts training hadn't specifically prepared her to handle. The skills that could quickly end her problems were precisely the ones she was morally and practically prohibited from using. Maya began researching other martial arts academies in the area, wondering if a change of training environment might help her regain emotional balance and perspective. The thought of leaving Professor Mendoza's academy felt like betrayal, but she worried that her current mental state was contaminating the positive environment that had sustained her for years. The internal conflict between loyalty to her instructor and concern about her emotional stability added another layer of stress to an already overwhelming situation. David Kim's friendship with Maya became increasingly complicated as Jessica's group began targeting him more directly for his association with their primary victim. Anonymous notes appeared in his locker questioning his judgment and suggesting that his political aspirations might be damaged by continued association with someone who was clearly having social problems. His debate team preparation was disrupted by missing materials and schedule changes that seemed designed to create conflicts with his time spent helping Maya with chemistry assignments. David's response to the indirect pressure was admirable, but also painful for Maya to witness. He refused to distance himself from their friendship despite obvious social and academic costs, and he began asking more direct questions about what was happening to her and how he might help address the problems. Maya appreciated his loyalty, but feared that his support was making him a target for harassment that could damage his college prospects and future opportunities. The decision of whether to confide fully in David became one of Maya's most difficult dilemmas. She trusted his discretion and valued his perspective, but she also understood that knowledge of the harassment campaign could put him in impossible positions where he would be forced to choose between supporting her and protecting himself. Maya had seen how quickly Jessica's group could escalate their attacks when they felt threatened or challenged, and she didn't want David to become collateral damage in a conflict that was fundamentally about her own survival. Maya's academic performance continued to decline despite her increased efforts to compensate for the ongoing sabotage and disruption. Her grade point average dropped for the first time in her high school career, falling just enough to potentially affect her class ranking and scholarship eligibility. The decline was particularly frustrating because it reflected external interference rather than reduced capability or effort. But college admissions committees would see only the final numbers without understanding the circumstances that had contributed to them. The stress of maintaining academic standards while managing constant harassment began to affect Maya's physical health in measurable ways. She developed frequent headaches that interfered with her ability to concentrate during classes and study sessions. Her immune system seemed compromised as she caught every minor illness that circulated through the school, resulting in missed classes that put her further behind in her coursework. The physical symptoms of chronic stress were becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss as temporary problems. Maya's work performance at the grocery store deteriorated as the harassment there intensified and her overall stress levels increased. She made calculation errors at the register that required supervisor correction, had difficulty maintaining friendly demeanor with customers who reminded her of her tormentors, and struggled to complete assigned tasks efficiently while constantly watching for signs of trouble. Her manager scheduled a formal performance review, to address the decline in her work quality and reliability. The grocery store performance review was a wake-up call for Maya about how significantly the harassment was affecting her ability to function in essential areas of her life. Her manager was sympathetic but clear that improvement was necessary to maintain her employment, and Maya realized that she was approaching a crisis point where her survival strategies were no longer sufficient to protect her interests. The conversation forced her to confront the reality that ignoring the harassment and hoping it would eventually stop was not a viable long-term approach. Maya's relationship with her younger brother Danny became strained as her increased stress and decreased availability affected her ability to provide the support and guidance he needed. Danny was already struggling with behavioral issues related to their father's death and their family's financial situation, and Maya's distraction and emotional unavailability made his problems worse. Arguments between the siblings became more frequent and intense, adding tension to their home environment that Elena struggled to manage while working long hours. The deterioration of Maya's relationship with Danny was particularly painful because she understood that her brother needed stability and support that she was no longer able to provide effectively. Danny had always looked up to his sister as a source of strength and guidance, and Maya could see that her obvious distress was affecting his sense of security and confidence. The guilt about failing her brother added another layer of emotional burden that made every other challenge more difficult to bear. Elena's concern about both of her children reached a breaking point when she discovered Danny had been involved in a minor incident at his own school that seemed related to anger and impulse control issues. The realization that Maya's problems were affecting Danny's behavior forced Elena to confront the reality that her family was experiencing a crisis that required direct intervention rather than hoping things would improve on their own. The family meeting that Elena called to address the growing problems in their household was awkward and emotional for everyone involved. Maya and Danny were both reluctant to admit the extent of their respective difficulties, while Elena felt overwhelmed by responsibilities that seemed beyond her ability to manage effectively. The conversation revealed how much each family member was struggling individually while trying to protect the others from additional worry and stress. Maya's decision to share limited information about the harassment she was experiencing represented a significant shift in her approach to handling the situation. She had been determined to protect her family from problems they couldn't solve, but the impact on Danny's behavior and Elena's stress levels made it clear that secrecy was creating more problems than it was preventing. The partial disclosure was difficult, but also provided some relief from the isolation that had been making every challenge feel insurmountable. Elena's reaction to learning about the harassment was a mixture of anger, guilt, and determination that surprised Maya with its intensity. Elena blamed herself for being too distracted by work and financial pressures to notice that her daughter was experiencing serious problems, and she immediately began researching options for addressing the situation through school administration and legal channels. The support was welcome but also concerning because Maya understood that parental intervention could escalate the conflict in unpredictable ways. The harassment campaign entered a new phase, as Jessica's group recognized that their traditional methods were not producing the desired results. Maya's resilience and continued presence at school despite months of psychological pressure had apparently frustrated her tormentors and motivated them to consider more dramatic approaches to achieving their goals. The shift toward direct confrontation and physical intimidation represented a dangerous escalation that increased the likelihood of serious consequences for everyone involved. Kayla Foster's role as the group's enforcer became more prominent, as Jessica decided that subtlety and plausible deniability were less important than achieving decisive results. Kayla began appearing in locations where Maya would be alone or vulnerable, using her physical size and aggressive demeanor to create situations that felt threatening without crossing legal lines. The implied threat of violence hung over every encounter, creating constant tension and fear that affected Maya's ability to move freely around school. The shift toward physical intimidation represented exactly the type of escalation that Maya's martial arts training had prepared her to handle, but it also created the moral and practical dilemmas that she had been hoping to avoid. Every threatening encounter with Kayla was an opportunity to resolve the harassment problem quickly and decisively, but it was also a risk of legal consequences and moral compromise that could destroy everything Maya had worked to achieve. Maya's internal struggle between her training as a martial artist and her goals as a student became increasingly difficult to manage as the harassment escalated toward direct confrontation. She found herself mentally rehearsing defensive techniques during classes, planning escape routes through school hallways, and analyzing potential threats in ways that indicated she was preparing for physical conflict, whether she consciously intended to or not. The transformation in Maya's mindset from victim to potential warrior was gradual but unmistakable to anyone who understood the signs. Her posture became more alert and confident. Her movement patterns shifted to accommodate tactical awareness, and her responses to intimidation attempts became less reactive and more controlled. Professor Mendoza noticed the changes during training sessions and recognized that one of his students was approaching a decision point that would define her character and future. Maya's academic situation continued to deteriorate as the harassment consumed increasing amounts of her mental and emotional energy. Her grades stabilized at levels that were acceptable but below her previous standards, and her participation in class discussions decreased as she became more focused on survival than intellectual engagement. Teachers who had previously regarded her as a model student began to see signs of a bright young woman who was struggling with personal problems that were affecting her academic potential. The college application process that should have been exciting and hopeful became another source of stress as Maya worried about whether her declining academic performance would affect her scholarship prospects and university admission chances. She had worked for years toward the goal of higher education as a path to better opportunities for herself and her family, and the possibility that harassment might derail those plans added urgency to her need to resolve the situation. Maya's research into legal options for addressing harassment revealed the frustrating reality that much of what she was experiencing fell into gray areas that were difficult to prosecute or prove in formal proceedings. The psychological nature of most attacks, the anonymous delivery of many threats, and the sophisticated understanding of legal boundaries demonstrated by her tormentors made traditional remedies ineffective or impractical to pursue. The documentation that Maya had been carefully maintaining throughout the harassment campaign represented hundreds of hours of detailed record-keeping, but even her meticulous notes struggled to capture the cumulative impact of constant psychological pressure and social manipulation. Individual incidents seemed minor when described in formal language, and the pattern of abuse was difficult to demonstrate to authority figures who hadn't witnessed the daily reality of living under siege. Maya's physical conditioning and fighting skills continued to improve, even as other areas of her life suffered under the pressure of ongoing harassment. Her training provided both mental outlet and practical preparation for confrontation that seemed increasingly inevitable. She found herself testing her techniques more aggressively during sparring sessions, pushing her limits in ways that would have been concerning if Professor Mendoza hadn't understood that she was working through difficult emotions in the safest available environment. The irony that Maya was becoming a more formidable fighter just as she was being forced to avoid fighting was not lost on her or her instructor. Professor Mendoza used their private conversations to reinforce the principles of martial arts philosophy, while acknowledging that sometimes external circumstances forced difficult decisions about when and how to apply training in real-world situations. Maya's relationship with David Kim evolved into something deeper and more meaningful as they both navigated the challenges created by Jessica's campaign against them. David's refusal to abandon their friendship despite obvious social costs demonstrated character and loyalty that Maya found both touching and concerning. Their shared experience of harassment created a bond that might not have developed under normal circumstances, but it also carried the weight of mutual protection and responsibility that complicated their feelings for each other. The romantic potential that existed between Maya and David remained largely unexplored, because both understood that deepening their relationship would provide additional ammunition for their tormentors, while creating emotional vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The restraint required to maintain appropriate boundaries while supporting each other through difficult circumstances was emotionally challenging, but also demonstrated maturity that distinguished them from their peers. Maya's social isolation at school became nearly complete, as other students learned that association with her carried risks they were unwilling to accept. The few classmates who might have been natural allies chose to maintain distance rather than become targets themselves, creating an environment where Maya moved through her daily routine, surrounded by people who acknowledged her existence but refused to engage meaningfully with her struggles. The loneliness of being surrounded by peers who were afraid to associate with her was perhaps more painful than direct attacks from her tormentors. Maya understood the practical reasons for other students' avoidance, but the emotional impact of complete social isolation added another layer of psychological pressure that made every day feel like an endurance test, rather than an educational experience. Maya's work schedule at the grocery store became more irregular as her manager tried to minimize conflicts between her and problematic customers while still providing the hours she needed to maintain her income. The accommodation was well-intentioned but also highlighted how significantly the harassment was affecting her ability to maintain normal employment, adding financial anxiety to her already overwhelming list of concerns. The grocery store situation reached a crisis point when Kayla Foster's disruptive behavior during one of Maya's shifts resulted in customer complaints and management intervention that reflected poorly on Maya's ability to handle difficult situations professionally. The incident forced Maya to choose between explaining the harassment and accepting responsibility for workplace problems that were beyond her control, neither of which offered satisfactory solutions to her employment concerns. Maya's physical and emotional exhaustion reached levels that began to affect her martial arts training for the first time since she had begun studying under Professor Mendoza. Her technique remained sharp, but her stamina and recovery time showed signs of the chronic stress that was depleting her energy reserves faster than rest and nutrition could replenish them. The decline in her training performance was subtle but noticeable to an instructor who had worked with her for years. Professor Mendoza's concern about Maya's deteriorating condition led to increasingly direct conversations about the source of her stress and the options available for addressing whatever was affecting her so dramatically. Maya's reluctance to provide complete information about her situation frustrated her instructor, who recognized that one of his most promising students was approaching a breaking point that could have serious consequences for her future. The spring semester drew toward its conclusion, with Maya's situation becoming increasingly unstable and unsustainable. The harassment campaign had achieved its goal of making her life at Lincoln High School miserable and stressful, but it had not succeeded in driving her away or breaking her spirit as Jessica's group had intended. The failure to achieve decisive victory had led to escalation and desperation that increased the likelihood of dramatic confrontation rather than gradual resolution. Maya's academic year was scheduled to end with final examinations and projects that would determine her final grades and class ranking. But the ongoing harassment made it difficult for her to focus on studying and preparation. The possibility that months of psychological warfare might ultimately succeed in damaging her academic record added urgency to her need to find a way to resolve the conflict before it destroyed everything she had worked to achieve. The stage was set for the final confrontation that would determine whether Maya's years of training and character development would prove sufficient to overcome the systematic campaign designed to destroy her high school experience. Jessica Manning's group had escalated their attacks to the point where continued subtlety was impossible, and Maya's emotional reserves were approaching the limits of what could be endured without decisive action. Maya's most treasured possession, the family photograph that represented everything she had lost and everything she was fighting to protect, remained safely secured in her backpack as a reminder of what truly mattered beyond the daily struggles of high school survival. She had no way of knowing that this symbol of her father's love and her family's bond would soon become the catalyst for revelations that would change everything for everyone involved in the months-long campaign of harassment and resistance. The final week of Maya's junior year arrived with the weight of accumulated stress and unresolved conflict hanging over every interaction at Lincoln High School. The spring air should have carried promises of summer freedom and academic achievement, but instead it felt thick with anticipation and barely contained hostility. Maya moved through her daily routines with the heightened awareness of someone who understood that the situation she had been managing for months was approaching a crisis point that would demand decisive action one way or another. Jessica Manning's frustration with her inability to break Maya's spirit had reached levels that affected her own social standing and self-image in ways she found intolerable. The quiet girl who should have transferred schools in tears months earlier was still attending classes, still maintaining her relationship with David Kim, and still refusing to acknowledge Jessica's superiority in the social hierarchy that defined high school existence. The failure to achieve complete victory over such an apparently vulnerable target had become a source of humiliation that Jessica could no longer ignore or rationalize away. The decision to escalate to direct physical confrontation represented a fundamental shift in Jessica's approach to handling what she had come to view as a personal affront to her authority and status. Previous campaigns against other students had succeeded through psychological pressure and social manipulation alone, making physical intimidation unnecessary and potentially risky from a disciplinary standpoint. But Maya's resilience had forced Jessica to consider methods that carried greater potential consequences, while also offering the possibility of decisive resolution. Maya's awareness of the changing dynamics was sharpened by her martial arts training and her growing understanding of predator behavior patterns. She recognized the signs of escalation in Kayla Foster's increasingly aggressive body language, the way conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and the gathering sense of anticipation that seemed to follow her through school hallways. Her years of studying conflict psychology as part of her martial arts education had taught her to recognize when situations were moving beyond verbal harassment toward physical confrontation. The family photograph that Maya carried as her most precious possession had become a source of both strength and vulnerability as the harassment campaign intensified. She found herself checking on it more frequently throughout each day, drawing comfort from the image of her complete family, while also worrying about what would happen if her tormentors discovered its existence and importance to her emotional stability. The photograph represented the last tangible connection to a time when she had felt completely safe and loved, making it irreplaceable in ways that Jessica's group couldn't have understood, but were about to exploit with devastating effectiveness. Maya's final classes of the academic year were taking place in an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that affected not only her own experience, but the learning environment for other students who had become unwitting observers of the months-long conflict. Teachers had begun to notice the unusual dynamics surrounding Maya and Jessica's group, though none had yet identified the full extent of the harassment campaign or understood their responsibility to intervene in what appeared to be typical teenage social drama. The cafeteria at Lincoln High School had always been a social battleground where hierarchies were established and maintained through subtle displays of power and exclusion, but Maya's presence there during the final week of school created an electric atmosphere that other students found both fascinating and uncomfortable. She sat alone at her usual table near the windows, methodically eating a sandwich she had prepared at home while reviewing notes for her upcoming chemistry final, apparently oblivious to the conversations and glances directed her way from every corner of the large room. Jessica Manning's entrance into the cafeteria that Tuesday afternoon was orchestrated with the theatrical precision of a monarch arriving to hold court, her three companions arranged around her in a formation that maximized their visual impact and social dominance. She moved through the room with calculated confidence, acknowledging greetings from various students while keeping her attention focused on Maya's solitary figure near the windows. The other students in the cafeteria seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen, conversations dying down as attention shifted toward the inevitable confrontation. Maya's peripheral vision tracked Jessica's approach while she continued to focus on her chemistry notes, her years of martial arts training having taught her to maintain situational awareness without appearing to monitor potential threats directly. She could feel the shift in the room's energy as other students recognized that the conflict they had been observing from a distance was about to reach some kind of resolution. Her heart rate increased slightly, but her breathing remained controlled and steady as she prepared for whatever form the confrontation might take. The backpack containing Maya's treasured family photographs sat on the floor beside her chair, its familiar weight and presence providing emotional anchoring as she navigated the increasingly dangerous social environment. She had developed unconscious protective habits around the bag, positioning it where she could monitor it while keeping it close enough to grab quickly if circumstances required rapid movement. The photograph inside represented everything she was fighting to preserve and protect, though she had no way of anticipating how directly it was about to become involved in the confrontation she had been avoiding for months. Jessica's decision to target the backpack specifically represented either brilliant psychological strategy or incredibly poor judgment about the consequences of crossing certain emotional boundaries. She had observed Maya's protective behavior toward the bag and correctly identified that it contained something of significant personal value, but she could not have understood that destroying its contents would transform a controlled and disciplined young woman into someone willing to abandon years of careful self-restraint in favor of immediate and overwhelming retaliation. The approach to Maya's table was made with deliberate slowness that allowed other students to recognize what was happening and position themselves to observe the confrontation without appearing to be directly involved. Amber Chen carried her phone openly, apparently prepared to record whatever transpired for later distribution and analysis. Brittany Walsh positioned herself to block potential escape routes, while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Kayla Foster took up a position that would allow her to provide physical intimidation if verbal harassment proved insufficient to achieve their goals. Maya's hands remained steady as she continued to review her chemistry notes, though every muscle in her body was coiled and ready for action should the situation require physical response. Her years of martial arts training had taught her to project calm confidence even in threatening situations, understanding that apparent vulnerability often invited attack. while obvious preparation for conflict could serve as effective deterrent. She was ready for whatever form Jessica's final assault might take, though she desperately hoped that open confrontation could still be avoided. The conversation began with Jessica's trademark blend of false concern and barely concealed malice, her voice carrying just far enough to be heard by nearby tables while maintaining the appearance of private discussion between students. She expressed sympathy for Maya's obvious social isolation and academic stress, suggesting that perhaps Lincoln High School was simply too challenging and competitive for someone from Maya's background to handle successfully. The words were chosen carefully to sound supportive while delivering maximum psychological damage through their implications about Maya's worth and capabilities. Maya's response was measured and polite, thanking Jessica for her concern while making it clear that she was satisfied with her academic progress and social situation at Lincoln High School. She continued to focus on her notes while speaking, projecting the image of someone who was too busy with important work to engage in lengthy conversation with people who had consistently proven themselves unworthy of her time and attention. The controlled dismissal was clearly frustrating to Jessica, who had expected either fearful submission or angry reaction that would justify escalation. The shift toward direct aggression came when Jessica realized that verbal harassment was not producing the desired emotional response from her target. She reached across the table and swept Maya's chemistry notes onto the floor, scattering the carefully organized papers across the cafeteria's tile surface while smiling with false apology about her clumsiness. The action was clearly deliberate, but designed to appear accidental to any adult observers who might question the incident later. Maya's reaction to the scattered notes was immediate but controlled, her martial arts training allowing her to channel anger into focused action rather than emotional outburst. She calmly began collecting the papers while maintaining eye contact with Jessica, her movements precise and deliberate in ways that suggested complete self-control rather than intimidation or fear. The response clearly frustrated Jessica, who had expected either tears or rage that would provide justification for further escalation. The decision to target Maya's backpack directly represented the point of no return in a conflict that had been building for months through accumulated harassment and psychological pressure. Jessica grabbed the bag from its position beside Maya's chair, holding it just out of reach while commenting loudly about its worn appearance and wondering what someone like Maya might consider valuable enough to guard so protectively. The action crossed multiple boundaries simultaneously, involving theft, invasion of privacy, and direct challenge to Maya's ability to protect what belonged to her. Maya's demand for the immediate return of her backpack was delivered in a voice that carried unmistakable authority, despite its quiet volume, the tone of someone who was prepared to take decisive action to recover stolen property regardless of social or disciplinary consequences. Other students in the cafeteria recognized the shift in dynamics, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something more serious than typical teenage conflict. The atmosphere in the room became charged with anticipation and nervous energy as observers waited to see how the confrontation would resolve. Jessica's response to Maya's demand involved opening the backpack and dumping its contents onto the cafeteria table, creating a display of Maya's personal possessions that violated her privacy while providing opportunities for additional humiliation and destruction. Textbooks, pens, and school supplies scattered across the surface, but Jessica's attention focused immediately on the small plastic sleeve containing the family photograph that Maya treasured above all other possessions. The moment when Jessica extracted the photograph from its protective sleeve represented the culmination of months of harassment and the beginning of consequences that none of the participants could have fully anticipated. She held the image up for inspection, commenting loudly about its poor quality and wondering why someone would carry around such an obviously outdated family picture. Her voice carried clearly throughout the cafeteria as she criticized the clothing, setting, and general appearance of the people in the photograph with deliberate cruelty designed to maximize public humiliation. Maya's reaction to seeing her most precious possession in Jessica's hands was immediate and visceral, her carefully maintained emotional control cracking for the first time as protective instincts overwhelmed tactical considerations. She stood quickly and reached for the photograph, her voice carrying a desperate edge as she demanded its immediate return. The shift from controlled dismissal to obvious emotional investment was exactly what Jessica had been seeking, providing the vulnerability that could be exploited for maximum psychological damage. The tearing of the photograph happened with deliberate slowness that allowed every student in the cafeteria to witness the destruction of something that was clearly irreplaceable and precious to Maya. Jessica held the image in both hands and pulled it apart down the middle, separating Maya's father from the rest of the family, while commenting about how much better the picture looked without certain people in it. The pieces fluttered to the floor like confetti, each fragment representing irreplaceable memories and connections that could never be restored or repaired. Maya's response to the destruction of her family photograph was unlike anything Jessica's group had anticipated or prepared to handle. The quiet girl who had endured months of harassment without significant retaliation was transformed in an instant into someone whose years of martial arts training and accumulated rage were finally aligned toward a single purpose. Her movement toward Jessica was fluid and purposeful, closing distance with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years learning to fight effectively against larger and stronger opponents. The first physical contact between Maya and Jessica occurred when Maya grabbed Jessica's wrist with sufficient force to prevent further damage to the remaining pieces of the photograph, while demonstrating strength that surprised everyone who witnessed it. Maya's grip was precisely controlled to cause discomfort without lasting injury, but it was also unmistakably powerful in ways that revealed hidden capabilities that none of her classmates had suspected she possessed. Jessica's attempt to pull away from Maya's grip resulted in a brief struggle that quickly demonstrated the vast difference in their physical capabilities and training levels. Maya's years of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and mixed martial arts training allowed her to control Jessica's movements with minimal effort while maintaining her own balance and positioning. The ease with which she dominated someone who had been intimidating her for months was both satisfying and terrifying, as Maya realized how completely the power dynamic had shifted in her favor. Kayla Foster's intervention as the designated enforcer of Jessica's group represented exactly the escalation that Maya had been dreading and preparing for throughout the months of harassment. Kayla moved toward the confrontation with obvious aggressive intent, her larger size and reputation for violence making her approach genuinely threatening to most students who might have found themselves in Maya's position. But Maya was not most students, and her response to Kayla's advance demonstrated capabilities that shocked everyone who witnessed them. The takedown technique that Maya used on Kayla was executed with textbook precision, using Kayla's forward momentum and aggressive approach against her, while requiring minimal effort from Maya herself. Kayla found herself on the cafeteria floor in a controlled submission hold before she fully understood what had happened, her size and strength advantages completely neutralized by Maya's superior technique and tactical positioning. The speed and effectiveness of the technique left no doubt that Maya possessed genuine fighting skills that she had been carefully concealing. Amber Chen's attempt to document the confrontation with her phone became complicated when Maya calmly informed her that recording without permission could constitute harassment, and that continued filming might result in the phone being confiscated and its contents reviewed by school administration. Maya's knowledge of relevant policies and legal implications demonstrated strategic thinking that extended beyond physical confrontation into longer-term consequences and reputation management. Brittany Walsh's positioning to block escape routes became irrelevant when it became clear that Maya had no intention of fleeing from a confrontation that she was clearly capable of controlling completely. The psychological dynamics that had defined their relationship for months were permanently altered as Jessica's group realized that their victim possessed capabilities that made their previous intimidation tactics not only ineffective, but potentially dangerous to continue pursuing. The gathering crowd of students who had assembled to witness the confrontation found themselves observing something far more dramatic and decisive than the typical cafeteria altercation they had expected. Maya's demonstration of martial arts skills was unlike anything most of them had seen outside of movies or television, and the complete reversal of expected power dynamics left many observers struggling to process what they were witnessing. Maya's decision to release Kayla from the submission hold after demonstrating complete control represented the kind of restraint and tactical thinking that distinguished trained martial artists from ordinary fighters. She had proven her point about relative capabilities without causing unnecessary injury or creating legal complications that could affect her academic future. The message was clear. Further physical confrontation would not end favorably for Jessica's group. The aftermath of the physical confrontation left Jessica's group in complete disarray, as they struggled to process the reality that their months-long harassment campaign had not only failed, but had revealed them to be powerless against someone they had dramatically underestimated. Jessica found herself facing the humiliation of public defeat at the hands of someone she had considered inferior, while her companions dealt with the realization that their reputation for intimidation had been shattered by a single encounter. Maya's collection of the torn photograph pieces from the cafeteria floor was performed with dignity and composure that impressed observers who had just witnessed her physical capabilities. She gathered each fragment carefully, treating the damaged image with obvious reverence while maintaining awareness of her surroundings and potential continued threats. The contrast between her emotional investment in the photograph and her controlled response to its destruction demonstrated character that resonated with students who had been watching the months-long conflict. The administrative response to the cafeteria incident was swift and comprehensive, as school officials recognized that a significant confrontation had occurred that required immediate investigation and resolution. Maya's documentation of the harassment campaign suddenly became relevant, as administrators sought to understand the context that had led to physical altercation between students who had no obvious history of conflict. Principal Williams' investigation into the incident revealed the extent of the harassment campaign that had been operating under the radar of school administration for months. Maya's meticulous records, combined with witness statements from students who had observed various incidents, painted a picture of systematic psychological warfare that explained the cafeteria confrontation as defensive action rather than unprovoked aggression. Jessica Manning's family connections and social influence proved insufficient to protect her from consequences when the full scope of her group's harassment campaign became clear to school administration and legal authorities. The documentation that Maya had maintained throughout the ordeal provided evidence that supported serious disciplinary action and potential criminal charges for harassment, intimidation, and destruction of personal property. The transformation in Maya's social status at Lincoln High School was immediate and dramatic as word spread about her hidden martial arts skills and her decisive handling of the confrontation with Jessica's group. Students who had avoided her out of fear of becoming targets themselves began approaching her with respect and curiosity, eager to understand how someone they had perceived as vulnerable had possessed such impressive capabilities all along. David Kim's reaction to learning about Maya's martial arts background was a mixture of admiration, relief, and slight embarrassment that he had spent months worrying about protecting someone who was clearly capable of protecting herself. Their relationship deepened as Maya finally felt free to share important aspects of her identity that she had been forced to conceal, while David gained new appreciation for the strength and discipline that had attracted him to her initially. Professor Mendoza's response to learning about Maya's school situation was characteristically measured, but clearly proud of how his student had handled an extremely difficult situation, with appropriate restraint and tactical thinking. The incident provided an opportunity for discussions about real-world application of martial arts principles and the importance of using physical skills only when no other options existed for resolving conflicts. Elena Rodriguez's reaction to the full revelation of what her daughter had been enduring and concealing was a complex mixture of anger, pride, and guilt that she had not recognized the extent of Maya's struggles earlier. The incident prompted important conversations about family communication and support systems, while also revealing Maya's remarkable strength and resilience in handling serious challenges largely on her own. Maya's academic recovery from the stress and disruption of the harassment campaign was aided by the removal of constant psychological pressure and the support of administrators who finally understood the context of her declining performance. Her grades improved dramatically during final examinations as she was able to focus on learning rather than survival, demonstrating the academic potential that harassment had been suppressing. The legal consequences for Jessica's group included restraining orders, community service requirements, and mandatory counseling that addressed the psychological factors that had motivated their harassment campaign. The serious nature of the charges and potential college admission implications forced them to confront the reality that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond high school social dynamics. Maya's decision to use her experience as motivation for advocacy work, helping other harassment victims, represented a positive transformation of trauma into purpose and social contribution. She began volunteering with organizations that provided support and resources for students experiencing bullying, while continuing her own academic and martial arts development with renewed focus and confidence. The family photograph that had been torn apart during the cafeteria confrontation was carefully reconstructed and preserved as a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up for what matters most. While the physical damage could never be completely repaired, the image regained its place as Maya's most treasured possession and reminder of the love and strength that had sustained her through the most difficult period of her young life. The story of Maya Rodriguez's transformation from harassment victim to empowered advocate spread throughout the school district and beyond, inspiring other students to document their own experiences with bullying while demonstrating that sometimes the quietest people possess the greatest strength. Her example proved that proper preparation, documentation, and strategic thinking could overcome even systematic campaigns of psychological warfare when combined with the courage to take decisive action when all other options had been exhausted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.